Welcome to this series of Coping with COVID-19. My name is Gerry Vassar. I'm President and CEO of Lakeside.
Hi, I'm Diane Wagenhals. I'm the Program Director for Lakeside Global Institute.
As you can see, we are in an empty building, and so many of us are in situations where we're confined to home. We have to social distance. We're wearing masks now, at least in Pennsylvania. And this whole the idea of how we isolate and how we deal with all the ramifications of this pandemic has been interesting in its impact. So we're going to do a series of discussions on that impact with people and to begin to discuss some strategies and ideas and even get perspective on really what's going on for many of us. I'm hearing so many stories of people having issues of I'm irritated, I'm frustrated, I'm feeling lost, my brain is mush, I'm not sure where I'm going, what about the future, things that are very difficult, like I've lost my job and I'm not sure what's going to happen to my job in the future, so there's fear and anxiety about that. There's economic issues, there's unemployment issues, there's students being at home, there's family issues that are going on, so there's a little pressure testing of some of our social ills that are going on as well. So there's a lot happening, Diane, and people are beginning to feel that, well, I'm kind of done with this, let's move on, because I think in most of the crisis, there's an endpoint.
Yes.
And this feels very, very...
We don't know the endpoint.
We don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how it's going to look, so there's a lot of the unknown that's in front of us.
Yes.
So I think as people are experiencing this particular scenario, there are a lot of things going on neurologically. And we like in our world of trauma to understand how the brain is functioning. And Diane, I know you're a researcher, you're a writer, you've done a lot of our curriculum in trauma, and you have talked through these issues with people even at a personal level as well as in group training with people who are dealing with people in trauma. So you've got a lot of depth in your understanding of what's going on neurologically with people. And I don't think we would associate these ideas of staying at home and being isolated like we are and all the other issues that go with it with trauma. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is this that's going on and how does it relate to the idea of trauma?
The first thing, as you were talking, that came to mind is the old adage that knowledge is power. And in a lot of ways, I think we feel so powerless in all that's going on. So a little knowledge can be, as long as it's accurate and digestible, can really help empower us. And so this idea of the neuroscience, meaning brain science, what is it that's going on in our brains, can be empowering because, interestingly, as we think about our brains, here's a big question, use our mind to think about our brains. It's a whole concept of where's the mind, where's the brain. But as we use our abilities to think about our brain, we can actually influence our brain. So neuroscience takes us down a lot of paths, and it can be helpful. I find I drown sometimes, and I've been doing the research for a long time. I can drown in the technical stuff that some people share about trauma, usually sharing it from clinician to clinician or scientist to scientist. But what about for the everyday person? What about for the average person who would just tell me a few things I need to know? And so when we look at this, the truth is that it is having impact on our brains. Each one of us has had something change within our brains because of all of this. And so I think, do you want some other details or is that?
Well, why don't we talk with some definitions of trauma so we can begin to attach that to what we're experiencing with COVID.
Here's the interesting thing about trauma. There are dozens of internationally known experts on trauma, and they argue over a lot of the things about what's happening in the brain and all kinds of things. So defining trauma is a challenge, but there's some basics that seem to come up that everyone who is an expert on trauma comes back to.
So there's some consistent things that we know, facts that we know about it.
Yes.
And those are?
Some of those consistent things, it's when our bodies and our minds are overwhelmed by something and it's a fearful situation. We're feeling terribly threatened and in danger, and it's inescapable. So some of the factors that make something in our brain be like an electrical jolt that sets off an alarm system that just goes all throughout our brain, creates this overwhelming sensation. And it's important to know that it's about sensations. Some people think it's about what am I thinking about something. And it turns out that trauma is not stored as a thinking thing. It's a sensory thing. It's not even an emotional thing. It's not about how we're feeling. It's way deeper in our nervous system. And what happens is that deep inside the nervous system, we are hit with this sensation that we're in such trouble, either we're at risk of dying or being hurt, or someone we love, something terrible is going to happen, and we are powerless to stop it. So stop and think about what's been going on. It's scary. We've had so many tragic things happen. We're seeing stuff on the news. It's having impact as we watch it, as we think about it, as we hear things. It's impacting us at this sensory level. And I think that can be important because when we talk about what are we going to do about it, we need to start with that understanding because we can't heal this or even cope with it just by using our thinking.
And what I think we notice is some people cope with it better or differently than others.
Yeah.
Is there any identifying factors as to which individuals, how they do it differently or better or anything like that?
The way you're doing your hands makes me think about a dance. We're all dancing with this differently.
Yeah.
Somebody's doing the cha-cha-cha over here and somebody's doing some other dance, ballroom dancing.
It's kind of what's going on.
Pretty much, except social distancing means we can't do that.
Right.
But yeah, I think because each trauma is unique, each person is unique, and that's a trite thing to say, but the complexity of us each as a human being, we're talking about, billions and billions of neurons in our brains, and they're all firing and wiring and talking to each other and all, and trying to understand how do you understand billions of anything? So, and then each person's unique, and they have all their histories. And you and I have talked about, if somebody has a trauma history, and we'll talk more about that in another session. But if you come into this already with trauma experiences, then you're going to have a different reaction because you have a history of trauma than if you don't have such significant trauma in your world that there's something that's going to trigger you and cause flashbacks and have you remember previous things. So yeah, it's very, very different. Your temperament makes it different. People like me who tend to be more introverted aren't as freaked out by the fact that I have to stay in the house because temperamentally I'm pretty shy. So being pushed to go out, I have to work at it. There's other people that are like, get me out of here because I love being social. I live on being social.
Right. So that's the introvert-extrovert idea.
Yeah.
So those people, each of those temperaments coped a bit differently.
Yeah.
The extrovert who can't see anyone are going to try to find out ways to connect.
Oh, yeah.
And the introvert's probably going to become a little bit more comfortable, maybe too comfortable with being alone.
It's really interesting how much that difference exists. I see it in people around me, like, okay, you're an extrovert. I can tell you're climbing the walls because you need the social thing. And so there's just so many factors in understanding this. I think the most important thing is that you can take a journey of understanding, and we're going to talk about that in our next segment, about what it is you need to know about what happens to any of us as we're going through this in terms of being in a different place.
And one more question. A lot of times when we think about trauma and a trauma history and experiencing something in the present, we start thinking about time issues. Is this about what happened to us before, or is this what's happening to us now? The imprint versus am I reliving something, or am I experiencing something now? What's the time dynamic here?
First of all, trauma doesn't have a time piece to it.
Wow.
It's not really a memory where your brain knows that it's happened in the past. The problem with traumatic memories, from what I understand, is that the past and the present and the future don't matter because it's being stored in a lower part of the brain that doesn't have a watch. And other parts of the brain are very time sensitive and time aware. So it's not something that your brain knows where you are in time. So if you have a trauma history and stuff it's called triggered when a memory is suddenly activated. And then sometimes you have a flashback, which is when it just pops up like it's right there and you're back in an experience. But your brain doesn't know that you're not here and safe. It thinks you're having that experience all over again. And so the time thing is fascinating.
I remember the quote from Bessel van der Kolk. It says, it's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people which determines the fact that it's trauma.
Yeah.
And as I think about everyone out there that are experiencing all this emotional, relational claustrophobia that we're in, I'm thinking that that's really identifying a level of maybe a new trauma or a continuing trauma for them, and it's beginning to affect how our brains function,
Right.
which I think is one of those imprints that are probably going to last a long time for a lot of us.
Decades. They're the estimates of what the impact of this is going to be. It's almost like the impact of major wars or, things that will go on and be remembered down in history. So I think that's a very important thing to realize. One of the things that makes a trauma not turn into a profoundly deep post-traumatic stress disorder kind of thing is when people can talk about it. If you're sitting there, I'm going to encourage anybody who's watching this to think about what your thoughts are and what your sensations are. What happens to your body when you hear us talking? Mm-hmm. Because that's sending you messages. And if you can put words to it, you can get some of your power. You can have a sense of, and I go back to sense, that there are some things that I can do. And that's going to be essential as we talk about all of this. So please notice that. Notice as we're talking what jumps up for you, and pay attention to what happens when you hear about any of this stuff, whether it's us or the news or friends and family talking. If you can pause and say, what's going on for me on the inside, especially with your senses.
So those are great words to think about and to end this session with, that we really are experiencing something unique in our lifetime, in our society, in our world. It's going to definitely have some impact to how our brains are functioning that certainly is just like trauma narratives that we have, and this will be one. It will last for a very long time, and we need to talk about it. So that's what we're going to do in sessions, and the rest of our sessions in this Coping with COVID-19 series is explore a little bit more of these kinds of issues so that we can talk about it and be intelligent about it and find ways to cope and find resilience in this whole process. So thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for our session 2 of Coping with COVID-19.